In January 2026, the President of the United States went on camera and admitted something that no American president has ever admitted publicly before. He told the world that the United States possesses the capability to remotely shut down the power grid of an entire foreign country from thousands of miles away using nothing but a keyboard and a classified network connection. He was talking about Venezuela. During the operation to capture Nicolas Maduro, U.S. Cyber Command reportedly launched a cyber attack that strategically turned the power off and on across Venezuela, plunging millions of people into darkness as a tactical maneuver, and the president described it by saying it was due to a certain expertise that we have. He said it casually, almost proudly, like he was describing a new feature on his phone rather than the most consequential military capability revealed in a generation. But I need you to stop everything you are doing and think about what he actually revealed, because it is the most terrifying admission any sitting president has made in the 21st century. He confirmed on live television in front of every intelligence agency on the planet that the technology exists to remotely collapse a national electrical grid. He showed the world that an entire country's lights, water, hospitals, communications, and economy can be switched off from the outside. And here is what nobody in the mainstream media asked afterward, the question that should have been screamed from the front page of every newspaper in America. If the United States can do this to Venezuela, what makes you think China, Russia, and Iran cannot do the exact same thing to us? Because I am about to show you the evidence that they already can. They are already inside. They have been inside for years. And the only thing standing between 330 million Americans and a grid collapse is the geopolitical calculation of when to pull the trigger. The cybersecurity threat I am about to describe to you is not hypothetical. It is not a war game scenario dreamed up by analysts in a think tank. It is not something from a movie or a novel. It is happening right now, today, confirmed in writing by the FBI, the NSA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the Department of Energy. There is a Chinese state-sponsored hacking operation called Typhoon that has successfully infiltrated the computer networks controlling American power plants, water treatment facilities, transportation systems, and telecommunications infrastructure across the continental United States and its territories, including the military hub of Guam. They have been inside these systems since at least 2021, and some cybersecurity experts believe it started much earlier than that. CISA, the FBI, and the NSA issued a joint advisory stating with high confidence that Typhoon actors are pre-positioning themselves on IT networks to enable lateral movement to operational technology assets to disrupt functions. I need you to hear that word. Pre-positioning. It does not mean they are trying to get in. It means they are already in. They have already broken through the perimeter, already planted their tools, already mapped the control systems, and are already sitting inside the networks that manage your electricity, your water, your gas pipelines, and your ability to make a phone call, patiently waiting for the right geopolitical moment to activate everything they have put in place. The U.S. authoring agencies confirmed that Typhoon has maintained access and footholds within some victim IT environments for at least 5 years. 5 years of silent, undetected presence inside the operational control systems of American critical infrastructure. And the most chilling assessment, which came directly from cybersecurity experts advising the federal government, is that this campaign may never be fully rooted out of U.S. energy and other systems. That is not speculation from a blogger or a podcaster. That is a direct assessment from the people whose entire career is protecting these networks. The intruders are so deeply embedded, using legitimate system tools and valid employee credentials to disguise their activities as normal operations, that removing them completely may be functionally impossible without rebuilding entire network architectures from the ground up, which would take years and cost billions of dollars that nobody has budgeted for. And Typhoon is not even the only threat actor. Typhoon is a separate Chinese operation that in 2024 exploited vulnerabilities in the networks of AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile, gaining access to the private communications of millions of Americans. Typhoon is yet another operation targeting similar infrastructure. A House Committee on Homeland Security hearing in March 2026 laid out the scope of the problem in terms that would make your blood run cold. A witness testified that through Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and Flax Typhoon, the Chinese Communist Party has embedded itself in our energy, communications, and water systems to set conditions for destructive attacks during a Pacific conflict over Taiwan. The nominee for the next commander of U.S. Cyber Command, Lieutenant General Joshua Rudd, told Congress in January 2026 that the threat posed by the placement of tools to attack essential services in the United States threatens stability and carries the unacceptable risk of causing civilian casualties, both in a potential conflict and in peacetime. He said civilian casualties. That is a three-star general telling the United States Senate that Chinese hackers inside the American power grid could kill American civilians, not during a war, but during peacetime if the intrusions are left undefended. And here is the part that should make you furious. While the general was issuing that warning, the administration was simultaneously firing over 1,000C CISA cybersecurity staff and transferring others to completely unrelated agencies like immigration and customs enforcement. The people whose job it is to defend the grid from exactly this kind of attack were being reassigned to work on immigration. One congressman asked the obvious question, does that make our country safer and more able to respond to these increasing cybersecurity attacks? The answer is so obvious it does not need to be stated, but the cyber threat is only half the story, and honestly, it might be the less immediate half. Because while foreign governments are quietly infiltrating the grid's digital infrastructure, a completely separate wave of physical attacks on the grid has been escalating to levels that the Department of Homeland Security describes as unprecedented. NERC's Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which tracks security incidents across North America, reported more than 3,500 physical security breaches against the power grid in 2025 alone. That is up from 2,800 in 2023, and the number has shown a tenfold increase over the past decade. These are not abstract incidents buried in government databases. In December 2022, two Duke Energy substations in Moore County, North Carolina, were shot up with rifles, knocking out power for more than 45,000 people for 5 days. In November 2024, a man in Tennessee was arrested for attempting to attack a Nashville substation using a drone armed with explosives. In December 2025, an engineer in San Jose, California, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for bombing electric transformers. In 2023, a neo-Nazi leader was indicted for plotting to attack 5 substations around Baltimore with firearms, with the explicit stated goal of destroying the entire city. The FBI has interrupted 3 separate white supremacist plots targeting substations, all coordinated through online extremist chat rooms. And those are just the ones that were caught. The Department of Energy data shows that power grid operators identified 200 instances of vandalism, suspicious activity, sabotage, or physical attacks in 2023 alone, comprising 58% of all reported incidents. The locations of most substations in America are publicly available through the U.S. Energy Information Administration. They are often in remote areas, surrounded by nothing but chain-link fencing, and sometimes not even that. The equipment inside, particularly the large power transformers, is worth millions of dollars, is in critically short supply, and takes 2 to 4 years to replace if destroyed. Now, I need to tell you about something that happened in Europe last year that almost nobody in America paid attention to, and it is the single most important case study for what could happen here this summer. On April 28, 2025, the entire electrical grid of Spain and Portugal collapsed without warning in the middle of a regular weekday afternoon. The Iberian Peninsula, which is home to nearly 60 million people and includes 2 of the largest economies in southern Europe, went completely dark. It was not a cyber attack. It was not a physical attack. It was not terrorism. It was a cascading equipment failure triggered by a sudden drop in renewable power generation that the grid could not compensate for fast enough. The imbalance between supply and demand happened in seconds. The frequency dropped. Protective relays began tripping offline in a chain reaction, and within moments the entire interconnected network collapsed like a house of cards. Traffic lights went dead across Madrid, Barcelona, Lisbon, and Seville simultaneously. Metro systems stopped in their tunnels with passengers trapped underground. Trains halted between stations. Hospitals switched to emergency generators that were never designed to power entire facilities for extended periods. Cell networks went down in waves as tower batteries drained, ATMs and credit card terminals froze across two entire nations at once. Airports in Madrid and Lisbon closed their runways. Factories shut down mid-production. Elevators stopped between floors with people inside them. The entire economy of two modern, wealthy, technologically advanced European nations ground to a halt in a matter of seconds, and it took more than 12 hours to restore power to most areas, with some regions remaining dark for much longer. And here is what is most terrifying about the Iberian blackout. It happened on a normal day. The weather was not extreme. Demand was not at peak. There was no crisis in progress. The grid simply lost its balance. And because the system had become more dependent on variable renewable sources without sufficient backup storage and dispatchable generation to compensate for sudden drops, it could not recover fast enough to prevent the cascade. Since the Iberian blackout, more batteries and grid-supporting equipment have been added across Europe, but the fundamental vulnerability, the one where a sudden generation shortfall can trigger a continental-scale cascade, remains. If that can happen to the grid of Spain and Portugal, which is newer, smaller, and less complex than the American grid, imagine what happens when the same type of cascading failure hits a system that is 3 times older, 10 times larger, being actively infiltrated by 3 hostile foreign intelligence services, being physically attacked by domestic extremists on a weekly basis, and already running at the bleeding edge of its capacity during a record-breaking heat wave with 36 states forecast for above normal temperatures. That is the American grid in the summer of 2026. That is what we are walking into with our eyes wide shut. Let me explain the specific mechanism by which a total grid collapse happens, because most people think a blackout means the power goes out in your neighborhood and someone flips a switch and it comes back. That is not how a grid collapse works. The electrical grid operates at a precise frequency, 60 Hz in the United States, and maintaining that frequency requires an exact real-time balance between the electricity being generated and the electricity being consumed at every single second. When a large generator trips offline unexpectedly, or when demand suddenly spikes because 100 million air conditioners kick on during a heat wave, the frequency drops. When the frequency drops, protective relays at other generators and substations automatically disconnect to protect their equipment from damage. But when those units disconnect, the frequency drops further, which triggers more disconnections, which drops the frequency again, and within seconds you have a cascading failure that can propagate across an entire interconnected grid like dominoes falling. This is exactly what happened in the 2003 Northeast blackout that took out power for 55 million people across 8 states and parts of Canada. The entire cascade, from the first alarm to total collapse, took approximately 9 seconds. 9 seconds to go from normal operation to the largest blackout in North American history. And here is what most people do not know about recovering from a cascading blackout. You cannot just turn everything back on at once. The grid has to be restarted piece by piece in a precise sequence called a black start, using specially designated generators that can start without an external power source. That process takes hours at minimum, days in most cases, and weeks if critical equipment like transformers has been damaged. During the 2003 blackout, some areas were without power for up to 4 days, and the total economic cost was estimated at $6 billion. But that event happened during relatively mild weather, and the grid was in significantly better condition than it is today. The condition of the grid today is something that should alarm every single person watching this video. According to NERC's 2026 Long-Term Reliability Assessment, summer peak electricity demand is forecast to rise by 224 gigawatts over the next decade, a projection that grew by more than 50% in just 1 year. That increase is roughly equivalent to adding the electricity consumption of 180 million homes to a grid that is already struggling to meet current demand. One analyst compared it to the last comparable surge in electricity demand, which happened during World War II. Except during World War II, the government was building power plants as fast as it could, and today the government is retiring them faster than they can be replaced. Over 83,000 megawatts of fossil fuel and nuclear generation is scheduled to close by 2028, and replacement resources are not coming online fast enough. Meanwhile, the International Energy Agency projects that data centers will consume 1,000 terawatt-hours of electricity globally by the end of this year, roughly equal to the entire electricity consumption of Japan. In the United States, data center demand will hit 75.8 gigawatts in 2026, according to S&P Global. Virginia alone saw data centers consume 26% of its total electricity supply in 2023. A single Meta data center project in Louisiana would consume roughly half the electricity of New York City at peak capacity. And all of this new demand is landing on a grid where 70% of the infrastructure is approaching the end of its designed lifespan. More than half of the 40 million distribution transformers in the country have already exceeded their expected service life. The supply shortfall for large power transformers is 30%. Lead times exceed 2 years, and 80% of them are imported, meaning tariffs, trade disputes, and shipping disruptions can cut off the supply chain at any moment. The Colonial Pipeline attack in 2021 gave us a glimpse of what a targeted infrastructure disruption looks like, and it should have been a permanent wake-up call. But America has the attention span of a goldfish when it comes to infrastructure threats. A single ransomware attack by a criminal group, not even a nation-state, shut down the pipeline that supplies 45% of all fuel to the East Coast for 5 days. Gas stations ran dry from Virginia to Florida. Panic buying erupted across a dozen states. Prices spiked overnight. The company paid $4.4 million in ransom, and the broader economic fallout ran into the hundreds of millions to billions of dollars. That was one pipeline, attacked by criminals. Now imagine a coordinated attack by a nation-state that simultaneously targets the power grid, the natural gas pipeline network, the telecommunications infrastructure, and the water systems, all of which Typhoon has already infiltrated. NERC conducts the largest-scale grid security exercise in the world called GridX, and its most recent scenario in November 2025 simulated exactly this kind of coordinated attack during a heat wave. The scenario was inspired by the 2026 World Cup and 2028 Olympics, recognizing that major events create irresistible targets for adversaries. The exercise involved vandalism, drone attacks, and ballistic assaults on substations happening simultaneously with cyber intrusions. The lesson from GridX was clear. The grid is not prepared for a coordinated multi-vector attack, and the consequences of one would be measured not in hours or days of disruption, but in weeks and months. What makes all of this exponentially worse is the emerging threat of AI-powered cyber attacks, which are evolving faster than defenses can adapt and are fundamentally changing the nature of cyber warfare. Checkpoint Research, a leading cybersecurity firm, published a report warning that 2026 is predicted to see a full-scale cyber clash between the United States and its adversaries, and that the boundary between cyber and geopolitics has all but disappeared. Their analysis found that when global geopolitical tensions exceed their long-term baseline by more than one standard deviation, cyber attacks targeting U.S. government and critical infrastructure increase by 35 to 45% in the following quarter. And right now, with the war in Iran, rising tensions over Taiwan, and an adversarial relationship with Russia that shows no signs of cooling, geopolitical tensions are not just above the baseline. They are through the roof. They are at levels not seen since the Cold War. AI-based malware is making attacks stealthier and more adaptive, capable of learning from defensive responses and adjusting its behavior in real time to evade detection. Traditional cybersecurity tools were designed to detect known patterns and signatures. AI-powered threats generate novel attack vectors that existing defenses have never encountered and cannot recognize. The Department of Energy issued its first-ever strategic plan to protect energy infrastructure from cybersecurity threats in February 2026, which tells you two things. First, that the threat has become so severe that it required an unprecedented response, and second, that the United States has been operating without a comprehensive strategic plan for energy cybersecurity for the entire history of the modern grid. We have been flying blind for decades. And we are only now, in 2026, at the most dangerous moment in the grid's history, beginning to assemble the instruments that should have been in place 20 years ago. The financial dimension of grid failure is something that gets completely ignored in most conversations about blackouts, and it is the dimension that would affect every single American regardless of where they live. The PJM interconnection, which operates the power grid for 65 million people across 13 states from New Jersey to Illinois, saw wholesale electricity prices surge 56% to $80.5 billion in 2025, driven largely by data center demand. An independent market analyst said the price impacts are very large and are not reversible. Not reversible. That means the cost of keeping your lights on has permanently jumped to a new level, and it is only going up from here. Utilities filed a record $31 billion in rate hike requests in 2025. The average residential electricity bill increased from $121 per month in 2021 to $156 in 2025, and the EIA projects the national average will hit 18 cents per kilowatt hour in 2026, up 37% from 2020. In communities near data center clusters, costs have risen by as much as 267%. The Center for American Progress found that at least 242 electric and natural gas utilities have already implemented, been approved for, or are proposing rate increases between 2025 and 2027, affecting over 111 million electric utility customers. The National Energy Assistance Directors Association estimates that household energy arrearages, meaning unpaid past due balances, rose 31% between December 2023 and June 2025. Forced disconnections climbed from 3 million households in 2023 to 3.5 million in 2024, and potentially 4 million in 2025. 4 million American families who lost their electricity because they could not afford it. And electricity prices are now outpacing groceries, gasoline, vehicles, and medicine as the fastest driver of inflation, making it the defining economic issue heading into the November midterms. Here is what I need you to understand about where we are right now, in April of 2026, because the convergence of threats facing the American grid has never been this severe, this concentrated, or this imminent. You have a grid where 70% of the physical infrastructure is approaching end of life. You have over 200 million Americans living in areas NERC classifies as elevated or high risk for power shortfalls. You have a transformer supply chain that is 30% short and 2 to 5 years behind on delivery. You have summer demand projected to shatter records in a year where 36 states are forecast for above normal temperatures and a potential super El Nino is forming in the Pacific. You have Chinese state hackers already embedded inside the control systems of power plants and water utilities with the confirmed capability and intent to cause disruption during a conflict. You have physical attacks on substations that have increased tenfold over the past decade, with over 3,500 security breaches reported in 2025 alone. You have the cybersecurity workforce at CISA gutted by over 1.0 staff. You have the Iberian Peninsula blackout proving that modern grids can collapse without warning on an ordinary day. You have AI-powered cyber attacks evolving faster than defenses, and you have 4 million households already disconnected because they cannot afford their electricity bills, heading into what forecasters are calling one of the hottest summers in recorded American history. Each of these threats alone would be serious. Together, they represent the most dangerous convergence of grid vulnerabilities in the history of American infrastructure. So what do? Because the institutions that are supposed to protect you from this have known about these vulnerabilities for decades and have failed to fix them. The Government Accountability Office has had grid security on its priority list for years. NERC has issued warnings every single year, and the problems have only gotten worse. Congress holds hearings, experts testify, reports are published, and then nothing fundamental changes. The 2018 President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council report on catastrophic power outages, which was specifically tasked with assessing the nation's preparedness for grid failures beyond modern experience, made sweeping recommendations that were largely shelved. The cavalry is not coming, not before this summer, not in time. So it falls on you to protect yourself and the people you love, and I am going to be very specific about what that means. You need water, at least 1 gallon per person per day, for a minimum of 7 days, because water treatment plants fail within 48 to 72 hours of a sustained blackout when the electric pumps stop running. That is for drinking only. You need additional water for cooking and basic sanitation. You need food that does not require refrigeration or cooking, enough for at least a week, and you need to rotate it so it does not expire while sitting in your closet. You need cash, real paper money, enough to cover essentials for 7 to 10 days, because every ATM, every credit card terminal, every Venmo and Apple Pay transaction in your area will be completely dead. You need a battery-powered or hand-crank radio, not just any radio, but one that receives NOAA weather radio frequencies, because that will be your only reliable source of emergency information when cell towers lose their 4 to 8 hours of backup battery power and your smartphone becomes an expensive paperweight. You need flashlights and extra batteries, stored somewhere you can find in the dark. You need to know where your important medications are, exactly how long they survive without refrigeration, and what your contingency plan is if the pharmacy down the street cannot process electronic prescriptions because their entire system is offline. If you or anyone in your household depends on electrically powered medical equipment, an oxygen concentrator, a CPAP machine, a home dialysis unit, you need a backup power solution, whether that is a portable generator with stored fuel or a battery backup system, and you need to test it before the emergency, not during it. You need a paper-based communication plan with your family. Write down names, phone numbers, physical addresses, designated meeting locations, and who is responsible for checking on whom. When every digital communication system in your region goes dark simultaneously, paper is the only technology that still works. If you have elderly relatives who live alone, you need to have the conversation with them now, not when the crisis is already underway, about what they will do, where they will go, and how often someone will physically check on them. During the 1995 Chicago heat wave, the majority of the 700 people who died were elderly individuals found alone in their homes, in some cases days after they had already passed, because nobody checked on them. That was 30 years ago. The heat is worse now. The grid is more fragile now. And social isolation among older Americans is worse now. The American grid is failing. That is not a political opinion. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is not fear-mongering from someone trying to sell you something. It is the assessed judgment of every federal agency tasked with monitoring it, every reliability organization that audits it, every intelligence agency that defends it, and every cybersecurity firm that tracks the threats against it. NERC says we are facing a step change in the risk environment. The FBI says Chinese hackers are pre-positioned inside the control systems. The Department of Homeland Security says physical attacks have increased tenfold in a decade. CISA issued its first-ever strategic plan for energy cybersecurity in 2026 because the threat finally became too large to ignore. The Iberian blackout proved that modern grids can collapse on an ordinary afternoon, and 4 million American families were already disconnected from the grid before summer even started because they could not pay their bills. Everything I have told you in this video is sourced, documented, and verifiable through federal government reports, congressional testimony, peer-reviewed research, and industry analysis. I did not make any of it up. I did not exaggerate it. If anything, the reality is worse than what I can fit into a single video because there are dimensions of this crisis, from natural gas pipeline vulnerabilities to the water energy nexus to the insurance industry's quiet retreat from climate-exposed regions that each deserve their own deep dive. But here is the bottom line. The grid that stands between you and the dark ages is one bad day away from proving it. And this summer has every ingredient to be that day. Drop a comment and tell me which part of this video shocked you the most. I read every single one. Subscribe and hit the bell because what is coming next is even more important than what you just heard. Share this with someone who needs to see it before the heat arrives. Stay safe out there. I will see you in the next one.